Something is building in Cleveland right now, and it's not showing up on the scoreboard. It's not a stat line, not a highlight, not even something you can point to in one single play. It's a feeling, a shift, the kind of tension that starts quietly, then spreads until everyone is talking about it, even if they don't fully understand why. At the center of it is Shedeur Sanders, not because he's taken over the league, not because he's already proven everything, but because of what's being said about him. The conversations, the debates, the reactions, they're starting to take on a life of their own. And once that happens in the NFL, things don't stay normal for long. Because this isn't just about how he's playing anymore, it's about how people see him. Some believe he's rising faster than expected, others aren't convinced he's ready for this level. And somewhere in the middle, a much louder narrative is forming, one that's pulling fans, analysts, and even casual viewers into a debate that feels bigger than it should be this early. And here's where it gets interesting. When opinions start to collide like this, the story stops being controlled by what happens on the field. It starts being shaped by perception, by repetition, by the loudest voices in the room. And right now, that noise is getting harder to ignore. Because in a league like the NFL, once your name becomes the center of a divided conversation, everything changes. The pressure hits differently, the expectations shift, and every single moment starts to carry more weight than it should. And for Shedeur Sanders, that moment is already here. It didn't happen all at once. There wasn't a single headline or one viral clip that flipped everything overnight. Instead, the conversation around Shedeur Sanders started to shift in pieces, small takes here, quiet criticisms there, until suddenly it felt like everyone was talking about him from completely different angles. One day you hear analysts praising his growth. They point to his timing, his confidence, the way he's starting to settle into the speed of the game. There's talk about potential, about how quickly he's adapting, about how the ceiling might be higher than people expected. But then, almost immediately, that narrative gets challenged. Other voices push back, saying the flashes aren't consistent enough, that the mistakes still show up, that the jump to this level might be bigger than it looks on the surface. And that's where things start to get complicated, because now it's not one story anymore. It's multiple versions of the same player, all being presented at the same time. One side sees progress, another sees hesitation, and a third starts questioning whether the attention itself is becoming part of the problem. Because in the NFL, media doesn't just describe what's happening, it shapes how it's understood. The way a performance is framed can change how people react to it. A good throw becomes a glimpse of greatness, or a routine play. A mistake becomes part of development, or a red flag. And once those labels start getting repeated, they stick. Right now, that's exactly what's happening. The coverage around Shedeur Sanders isn't settled, it's split. And when the voices covering a player can't agree, it creates something far more powerful than criticism or praise alone. It creates uncertainty. And uncertainty spreads fast, because once people start hearing different versions of the same story, they begin choosing sides, not based on full games or full context, but on clips, quotes, and quick reactions. And just like that, the conversation moves beyond analysis into something much louder. Because this isn't just coverage anymore. It's the beginning of a narrative war. Once the conversation splits, it doesn't stay controlled, it accelerates. And around Shedeur Sanders, that acceleration has turned into something much bigger than simple analysis. What's happening now isn't just coverage, it's a full-blown collision between what people see and what they're told to believe. On one side, you have the reality of his development, the reps, the timing, the adjustments that don't always show up in a box score, the small improvements that coaches notice but don't trend online. It's messy, it's inconsistent at times, but it's real. That's how young quarterbacks grow, through moments that don't always look perfect from the outside. But then there's the other side, the narrative. And the narrative doesn't wait for full context, it builds off fragments. A single throw gets clipped, replayed, debated. A mistake gets magnified, turned into a talking point, repeated until it starts to feel bigger than it actually is. And on the flip side, a great play can be elevated into something symbolic, something that represents more than just that moment. That's where the gap starts forming. Reality is slow, detailed, and often complicated. Narratives are fast, simplified, and designed to spread. And when those two don't match, people don't always notice the difference. They just react to whatever reaches them first. Right now, that gap is getting wider. Some analysts are doubling down on the idea that he's trending upward, pointing to subtle progress that suggests he's figuring things out. Others are leaning into the skepticism, focusing on what's missing, what's not consistent yet, what still feels unfinished. And then there's a third layer, the one that doesn't rely fully on either side, the takes that are built more on interpretation than evidence, where tone matters more than detail. That third layer is where things really heat up, because once opinions start being driven by perception instead of performance, the conversation becomes harder to control. It's no longer about breaking down what happened, it's about deciding what it means, and that's where debates stop being productive and start becoming personal. For Shedeur Sanders, this creates a completely different kind of pressure. Not just the pressure to improve, but the pressure of being constantly defined by voices outside the field. Every step forward gets questioned, every setback gets amplified, and even neutral moments start getting pulled into one narrative or another. And the most important part, none of this stays contained, because once narratives start clashing like this, they don't just exist in media spaces, they spill over into the audience. And that's exactly when the situation changes again. And that spillover happens fast. The moment the conversation leaves the studio and hits the audience, it takes on a completely different energy. Because fans don't just listen anymore, they react, they challenge, they amplify. And right now, the discussion around Shedeur Sanders is starting to split in a way that's impossible to ignore. On one side, you've got fans pushing back hard against the criticism. They're watching the same reps, the same clips, and coming to a completely different conclusion. To them, the judgment feels rushed. They see a young quarterback adjusting, learning, showing flashes that hint at something bigger. And their argument is simple. Development takes time. Not every mistake is a red flag. Not every inconsistency means failure. From their perspective, the noise is louder than it should be this early. But on the other side, there's a group that isn't buying into potential just yet. They're looking at the same moments and focusing on what's missing, the reads that aren't quick enough, the throws that don't connect, the stretches where things stall. And their stance is just as firm. This is the NFL. There are no shortcuts here. If you're on the field, expectations come with it. Fair or not, production matters now. And just like that, the middle ground starts to disappear. Because this isn't just a quiet disagreement, it's happening in real time across clips, comment sections, live discussions, and non-stop breakdowns. Every play gets pulled apart, every opinion gets challenged, and the more people engage, the more the divide grows. What could have been a normal evaluation process turns into something much more intense, a constant back and forth where nobody's really waiting for the full picture anymore. That's how the perception starts to drift, not based on complete performances, but on fragments that get repeated over and over. A single moment becomes a symbol, a short clip becomes an argument, and before long, the conversation isn't about what actually happened, it's about which side you're on. And once it reaches that point, something important shifts, because now it's no longer just about how Shedeur Sanders is playing, it's about how people have decided to see him. And that's where things start getting even more complicated. And once the conversation reaches that point, the challenge changes completely. Because now, Shedeur Sanders isn't just lining up against defenses, he's lining up against expectations, assumptions, and narratives that are already forming in real time. That's a different kind of competition. You can study film to read a defense. You can practice timing, footwork, decision-making, but there's no drill for perception, no playbook for how people interpret what you do. And right now, every single moment he has on the field is being filtered through a lens that's already divided. A clean throw doesn't just stay a clean throw anymore. For some, it's proof that everything is starting to click. For others, it's dismissed as the bare minimum. A mistake? That doesn't fade into the background. It gets replayed, questioned, turned into evidence for whatever side people already believe in. There's no neutral ground left. Every rep is being turned into a statement. And that's what makes this stage so difficult. Because when a player starts competing against narratives, consistency alone isn't enough. You don't just need good moments, you need undeniable ones. The kind that cut through the noise, the kind that force even the skeptics to pause for a second. But here's the problem. Narratives don't disappear easily. Once they take hold, they tend to stick, especially when they're being reinforced from multiple directions. A single performance might not change anything. Even a few strong moments can get brushed aside if they don't fit the existing storyline. That's how powerful perception becomes. It decides what gets highlighted and what gets ignored. So now, the pressure isn't just about improving, it's about shifting something that exists outside of pure performance. It's about stacking enough evidence, enough consistency, enough undeniable progress that the conversation has to adjust. And that's a much slower process than people realize. Because while fans argue and analysts debate, the player is stuck in the middle, trying to move forward while everything around him keeps trying to define where he stands. It's not just about proving you can play, it's about proving it in a way that breaks through the noise. And the reality is, not every player handles that well. Some start playing safer, some hesitate, some get pulled into the weight of it all. But what's happening next inside Cleveland tells a very different story. Step outside the noise for a second, and everything feels different. Inside the building of the Cleveland Browns, the conversation isn't chaotic, it isn't divided, and it definitely isn't driven by clips or headlines. It's quiet, focused, repetitive in the best way. Work, improve, compete. That's it. No debates, no narratives, just execution. And that contrast is what makes this situation so interesting. Because while the outside world is constantly trying to define Shedeur Sanders in real time, inside the locker room, nobody's rushing to label anything. Every rep is just another rep. Every throw is evaluated the same way. What worked, what didn't, what needs to be better next time. There's no overreaction, no sudden shifts based on one moment. It's a process, and it moves at its own pace. But that doesn't mean the outside pressure doesn't exist. Players feel it, even if they don't talk about it openly. They hear the questions in interviews. They see the conversations online. They know when certain names start coming up more than others. And when that happens, it creates an unspoken layer of intensity. Not forced, not dramatic, but present. Then there's the other part of this reality, the presence of Deshaun Watson. Experience, stability, a player who's already been through the highs and lows of the league. And whether it's said out loud or not, that comparison is always there in the background, not as a direct competition in every moment, but as a reference point. Proven versus potential, known versus developing. Every time Shedeur steps on the field, that contrast exists, not officially, not in a way that disrupts the locker room, but mentally, it's there, observed, measured, felt, because that's how this level works. Players don't just look at what you could be, they respond to what you consistently show, and that's where things start to tighten. Because now it's not just about learning anymore, it's about showing enough, often enough, to build trust in a space where trust isn't given easily. A well-timed throw matters more. A quick adjustment at the line stands out more. The way you respond after a mistake gets noticed in ways that don't show up anywhere publicly. Those are the details that shift how a locker room feels about a player. Not the loud moments, but the quiet ones, the ones that happen when nobody's really watching, except the people who matter most. And right now, those moments are starting to add up. Not in a way that changes everything overnight, not in a way that suddenly erases all doubt, but enough to create something subtle, something real. Because inside that building, the story isn't being argued, it's being built.
There's a point every young quarterback reaches where the pressure stops being background noise and starts becoming the main challenge. Not because anything dramatic happens on the field, but because everything around it begins to close in at once. And for Shedeur Sanders, that point is getting closer by the day. This is the phase where the margin for error shrinks without warning. The same throw that felt routine before suddenly carries weight. The same mistake that might have gone unnoticed earlier now sticks a little longer, gets talked about a little louder, gets remembered a little more clearly. It's not just about playing anymore, it's about how every moment is interpreted. And that's where a lot of players start to change. Not always in obvious ways, but in small decisions. They hesitate for a split second longer. They choose the safer option instead of trusting the read. They start thinking about the outcome before the play is even over. It's subtle, but at this level, subtle is everything. Because pressure like this doesn't just test skill, it tests identity. It forces a decision without ever asking the question directly. Are you going to protect yourself from mistakes, or are you going to keep pushing forward and risk them anyway? That's the breaking point. And what makes this situation even more intense is that it's happening while everything is being watched. Every adjustment, every reaction, every response after something goes wrong, it's all part of the evaluation now. Not just from coaches, but from teammates, from media, from fans who are already split on what they believe. But here's where it takes a turn. Because from what's being seen so far, Shedeur isn't pulling back. He's not shrinking into the moment. He's still letting the ball go, still taking chances, still playing with a level of confidence that doesn't match the weight surrounding him. And that's not normal at this stage, not when the scrutiny is this constant, this detailed, this divided. That kind of response says something, not about where he is right now, but how he's wired. Because staying aggressive when the environment is pushing you to be cautious, that's a choice. And it's one that separates players who stall from players who eventually break through. It doesn't mean everything is solved. It doesn't erase the inconsistencies or the questions that still exist, but it changes the trajectory. It keeps the door open. It shows that the pressure hasn't taken control, at least not yet. And slowly, almost quietly, that resistance starts to create a shift. Not a full transformation, not a complete turnaround, but just enough to make people start looking again, a little more closely this time. And that's where things begin to change, quietly, almost unnoticed at first. Not in a way that flips headlines overnight, not in a way that suddenly silences every critic, but in small moments, subtle details, the kind that don't always go viral, yet still carry weight. Around Shedeur Sanders, that shift is starting to take shape. It shows up in the way the conversation sounds now. It's no longer one-sided. It's no longer just praise or just doubt. It's divided. And that division matters more than people realize. Because when opinions start splitting down the middle, it usually means one thing. Something real is happening underneath the surface. You can see it in the way analysts talk about him now. The criticism is still there, but it's more measured. The praise is still there, but it's more cautious. There's a hesitation on both sides that didn't exist before, a pause, a sense that maybe the full story isn't as clear as it once seemed. And that hesitation comes from evidence, small, consistent flashes that are starting to add up. A quicker release on a tight window throw, a better read against pressure, a calm response after a mistake instead of forcing the next play. These aren't headline moments, but inside the game, they matter. They signal adjustment. They show adaptation. The difference now is that those moments aren't isolated anymore. They're starting to connect.
And when that happens, perception has no choice but to slowly adjust. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to create doubt in the doubt itself. Enough to make people question their earlier conclusions. Enough to shift the tone from certainty to curiosity. Because now the conversation isn't "he's not ready" or "he's already there." It's something much more uncomfortable. It's "he might be closer than we thought." And that question changes everything. It forces a deeper look. It forces patience where there wasn't any before. It forces both sides of the argument to slow down, even if they don't want to admit it. Because the truth is, irrelevant players don't get this kind of attention. They don't create this kind of division. They fade into the background, unnoticed, undiscussed. But that's not happening here. Right now, Shedeur Sanders is being watched more closely than ever, not because people have made up their minds, but because they haven't. And that uncertainty, that tension between what people believed and what they're starting to see, that's the signal. Something is shifting, and once that shift begins, it doesn't stop halfway. And this is where everything tightens, because once that shift begins, it doesn't just sit there, it builds pressure in a completely different way. For Shedeur Sanders, the conversation has officially moved past the early stage. It's no longer about raw potential or distant projection. Now, it's about proximity. How close is he really? That question changes the entire evaluation. Coaches start looking deeper, not just at what goes wrong, but at how often things go right. Teammates start paying attention to consistency, to rhythm, to whether the small improvements are starting to show up more frequently. And those details, those quiet, almost invisible details, begin to carry more weight than any single highlight ever could. Because this is the phase where trust starts forming. Not publicly, not in a way that shows up in headlines, but internally. A well-timed throw on a critical rep, a quick adjustment at the line that prevents a breakdown, a calm reaction when the pocket collapses, instead of forcing something that isn't there. These are the moments that shift how people inside the building see you. And right now, those moments are starting to appear more often. Not perfectly, not every time, but enough to make people pause before doubting, enough to create hesitation and criticism, enough to slowly replace uncertainty with something more balanced. That's the turning point. Because once perception starts being backed by repeated evidence, the tone has no choice but to adjust. The same voices that once leaned heavily in one direction begin to soften, not because they were wrong, but because the situation is evolving in real time. The gap between potential and production starts to shrink, even if it hasn't fully closed yet. But here's what makes this phase so intense. Nothing is guaranteed. The opportunity isn't locked in, the role isn't secured, the future isn't decided. Everything is still being earned rep by rep, moment by moment. And that's what creates the tension. He's close enough to be taken seriously, but not established enough to remove all doubt. That space, right there in the middle, is where careers either accelerate or stall. Some players hover in that zone, never fully breaking through, always showing flashes, but never taking control of the narrative. Others find a way to push past it, to turn those flashes into something undeniable. And the difference usually doesn't come from gradual progress alone. It comes from a moment, one sequence, one performance, one stretch where everything aligns at once. And based on how things are building right now, that moment doesn't feel far away anymore. And now it all comes down to the smallest distance that feels the biggest, the gap between almost and proven. That's where Shedeur Sanders is standing right now. Not at the beginning anymore, but not fully across the line either. Close enough to be taken seriously, but still far enough that every doubt hasn't completely disappeared. This is the most dangerous phase for any young quarterback, not because of failure, but because of uncertainty. You've shown enough to raise expectations, but not enough to fully control them. Every performance starts to carry more meaning than it should. Every drive feels like it's being measured against something bigger than just the moment. And the pressure here is different. It's not loud like the early criticism. It's quieter, heavier. It shows up in how every rep is evaluated, how every decision gets remembered. A strong sequence doesn't just build confidence, it raises the standard for what comes next. And anything less than that starts to feel like a step back, even if it's part of the natural process. That's what makes this gap so difficult to close. It's not just about improving anymore, it's about proving it in a way that leaves no room for interpretation. Because up to this point, everything can still be debated. Every positive can be questioned. Every flaw can be emphasized. The narrative can still go either way.
But once that gap closes, the conversation changes permanently. And inside the Cleveland Browns, that reality is fully understood. The process hasn't changed. Work, compete, earn it. But the stakes have. Every rep now feels like part of a larger decision, not one that's announced publicly, but one that's forming quietly behind the scenes. Coaches are watching closer. Teammates are noticing patterns. The picture is becoming clearer with each passing moment, still incomplete, but clearer. There's still areas that need tightening, moments where experience shows the difference, situations where the speed of the game demands quicker answers. But alongside that, there are signs, real signs, that the gap isn't as wide as it once looked. And that's when things become unpredictable. Because when the distance between potential and production starts to shrink, the question stops being if and becomes when. And that shift brings a different kind of tension, one that doesn't wait patiently, one that builds with every opportunity, every snap, every chance to either confirm the progress or reset the conversation again. Right now, he's standing right in the middle of that space, one step away from changing everything. And the next moment might be the one that decides which side he lands on. And this is where everything starts pointing toward one thing, the moment you can't predict, but you can feel coming. For Shedeur Sanders, it's no longer a question of development alone, it's about timing. Because every step he's taken, every rep, every adjustment, it's all building toward a single stretch where everything has to come together at once. That's how it works at this level. It's not always a full season that changes perception. Sometimes it's a drive, a sequence, a handful of plays where the speed slows down, the decisions come instantly, and the execution leaves no room for debate. The kind of moment where even if you've been skeptical, you pause and say, "That looked different." And when that happens, it doesn't stay contained. The same voices that were divided suddenly shift tone. The same clips that once fueled arguments now get replayed for a different reason, not to question, but to recognize. Because undeniable performance has a way of cutting through everything else. Right now, that moment hasn't happened yet, not in a way that fully flips the story, but the signs are there. You can feel it in how the conversation is evolving, and how the expectations are rising instead of fading, and how the attention around him isn't slowing down, it's increasing. That only happens when something is close. Because the league has seen this pattern before. A player hovers in that space between potential and proof, then suddenly breaks through in a way that forces everyone to adjust at the same time. No warning, no gradual acceptance, just a clear shift that's impossible to ignore. And when that happens, it won't be subtle. It won't need explanation. It won't need defense. It will speak for itself in real time. A performance that answers questions before they're even asked. A stretch where the hesitation disappears, where the execution matches the expectation, where everything that's been debated suddenly feels obvious. That's the moment that changes everything. Not just for fans or media, but inside the locker room, inside the organization, inside the trajectory of a career. And the reality is, moments like that don't wait forever. They show up, and you either take control of them or they pass you by. Right now, everything around Shedeur Sanders is building toward that exact point. And when it hits, there won't be any more guessing.
And when that moment finally arrives, everything around Shedeur Sanders changes at once. Not gradually, not over weeks of debate, instantly. Because in the NFL, there's a clear line between conversation and confirmation, and once a player crosses it, there's no going back. All the noise that built up along the way, the arguments, the divided opinions, the constant back and forth, it doesn't disappear, but it loses its power, because performance at the right time does something nothing else can. It settles debates without needing words. It forces people to adjust, even if they don't want to. And most importantly, it replaces uncertainty with clarity. That's what this entire stretch has been leading toward. Not just development, not just flashes, but proof. The kind that holds up no matter how you look at it. And until that moment happens, the questions will stay. The doubt will linger. The conversation will keep shifting. But once it does, there's no more middle ground.
because players don't stay in that space between potential and reality forever. They either take that step forward or they remain part of the almost category that never fully turns into something solid. And that's what makes this so intense right now. He's right on that edge, close enough that people are watching every move, close enough that expectations are rising with every rep, close enough that the next performance could tip everything in one direction. And that's the part nobody can control. Not the media, not the fans, not even the narratives that have followed him up to this point. Because when the moment shows up, it belongs to the player and the player alone. Right now, the buildup is undeniable. The attention is locked in. The pressure is exactly where it needs to be for something real to happen. And when it finally does, there won't be any debates left to have. Only the realization that everything people were arguing about has already been answered.